Proinnsias Breathnach is just retired as a senior lecturer in geography and great interest, critical interest in economics, as you'll hear from Maynooth. But he also was on the board of the IDA for some years, and so he has a fairly practical knowledge of the whole area of industrial policy and so on. So over to you, Proinnsias.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much. Thanks to TASC for the invitation to speak here today. Again, I have less time than I expected for this, so I'm going to shoot through this as fast as I can. I have a lot of tables and so on to show. So I'll just go through as quickly as possible. So again, most of you will be familiar with some of the ideas I talk about, but just in case, I'll just go through them. As an economic concept, competitiveness dates at least as far back as Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Smith, of course, being widely regarded as the founding father of modern economic theory. However, the academic and public policy interest in the issue of competitiveness mushroomed over the last 30 years in line with the process of globalisation, which was engendered in large part by the deregulation of international trade in goods, services, currency transactions, and so on. Also complemented by various developments in information communication technology. This meant, on the one hand, that firms and countries were presented with new opportunities to expand into overseas markets. On the other hand, it also opened up economies to new levels of competition from abroad. So firms and governments, therefore, developed a major interest in identifying the factors which would allow successful participation in global markets. In the case of Ireland, public interest in this issue dates back much further, essentially to the famous report penned by T.K. Whitaker as head of the Department of Finance in 1958 and Economic Development. And the key argument, I think, of this document was that if Ireland was to aspire to the living standards then emerging in Western Europe and North America, it would have to abandon the prevailing policy of economic autarky with its focus on supplying the very limited home market and develop a vibrant export base. And again, the basic argument here was that the Irish domestic economy was too small to make possible the economies of scale which facilitated enhanced productivity and therefore higher incomes. Now, this argument was pursued by the introduction of a policy to promote inward investment by export-oriented foreign firms, whose scale and range of operations was rapidly growing at the time. And this, in a sense, was a quick fix solution to the economic crisis conditions which applied in Ireland in the 1950s, but soon it became the fundamental and unchanging foundation of Irish industrial policy. And it did usher in strong growth in the export orientation of the Irish economy. It shows Irish exports as a percentage of GDP rising from about a quarter in 1950 to almost 100% in the year 2000, dropped a bit after 2007. Some economists see this as a reflection of declining competitiveness, but in fact I would show this was not the case, mainly due to the very rapid inflation of the domestic economy through the building boom. And in fact today the percentage of GDP, of exports to GDP, is 111% in 2012, the most recent year. In particular, of course, in the 1990s we had really a rapid growth in exports. It grew 3 times the pace of GDP. The compound annual growth rate in real terms was almost 14%, exactly twice the annual compound growth rate of the economy in general. So that Ireland's share of global exports doubled, in fact, from 6.64% to 1.22% between 1991 and the year 2000. So this gives an idea of the openness of the Irish economy. Exports of goods and services percentage of GDP, as I say in the previous diagram, Ireland 93.6%. And what's important here is to show that most economies are still pretty self-contained, especially the United States, but even a country as small as Denmark, in fact, goods and services still account for less than a half of GDP. So Ireland is unusual in terms of its openness and export orientation in a global context. So in this presentation, I will first of all address the questions of how one defines and measures competitiveness. I will then address what I think are 2 key myths which have become almost conventional wisdom about how Ireland's competitiveness fared in the years after 2000, leading up to the economic crisis in 2007-2008. The first of these was that the Irish economy experienced a serious loss of competitiveness in this period, and secondly, that this was due to rising labour costs vis-à-vis Ireland's main trading partners. So I will first of all challenge the view that Ireland actually lost competitiveness in this period, and I will then challenge the view that labour costs in Ireland's export sectors rose relative to other competitor countries. I will then challenge the view that labour costs in any case are an important element in determining national competitiveness, and I put forward an alternative view which argues for a wider interpretation of the factors involved in influencing competitiveness. Now, so just on the question of defining and measuring competitiveness, well, definitions of this term are many and varied, but for me the concept boils down to a very simple idea: the ability to sell products, which are goods and services in markets, non-monopoly markets. However, identifying and measuring the factors which contribute to this apparently simple parameter is a complex and frequently controversial question. Now, for many, if not most, conventional economists, and I'm going to use that phrase probably fairly frequently today, tend to reduce competitiveness to a straightforward matter of relative production costs, and particularly labour costs, and how they differ between countries. A typical representation of this view may be found in an article on Ireland's competitiveness which appeared in the Central Bank Quarterly Review in 2005 by Mark Cassidy and Derry O'Brien, which says international competitiveness relates to an economy's ability to compete in international markets by either producing goods at a lower cost or selling goods at a lower price than competitor countries. I think this is an extraordinarily simplistic view, and I'll try to illustrate this as we go along. I've added in this additional one because I'm going to come back to this quote again later on page 86. Wage costs are an important component in the total costs of producing exports. Just in fact, I don't think they are. So, despite this, despite the fact that I think it's a very simplistic view of what determines competitiveness, there's a vast economic literature based on applying this basic idea to international comparisons of competitiveness. Basically, the argument that the basic view being that the most competitive economies are those with the lowest costs, and especially those with the lowest labour costs. There's a lot of huge literature which starts with that basic assumption, essentially. Another common and more straightforward way of measuring competitiveness is to look at a country's share of global markets, and in particular to look at trends in this share as an indicator of rising or falling competitiveness. However, one needs to be very wary of various pitfalls in using this market share approach to looking at trends in competitiveness. For example, it is frequently, if not usually, assumed that a falling market share indicates declining competitiveness. However, this is not necessarily the case where markets are expanding, which yet the country could experience falling market share and rapidly rising exports at the same time. And I think this is particularly relevant in the case of Ireland, because the denomination of our exports by foreign firms, and in particular the IDA's ability to identify expanding sectors and to target investment in these sectors, which means that the bulk of Irish exports tend to be in sectors which are expanding globally. So, for example, if you look at Ireland's share of computer exports, computer services, Ireland's share of world exports in this sector declined from 1/3 in 2004 just over a fifth in 2009, which might indicate declining competitiveness. Or the actual value, the current value of exports rose by 80% in this particular period. So a declining share with rapidly growing absolute values. And so this indicates that we're actually losing competitiveness. I would argue, in fact, that where a country is experiencing absolute growth in exports, its competitiveness is improving, regardless of market share. Another common pitfall is the use of market share as an indicator of competitiveness. Another pitfall is to take trends in a country's share of total world exports as an indicator of competitiveness. So, for example, I've got from the most recent NCC competitive scorecard, it says, while the value of exports has increased, Ireland's share of world trade remains at pre-recession levels and declined over the past decade, and this is presented as an indicator of declining competitiveness. And this is indeed true. Ireland's share of global exports did decline between 2001 and 2011 from 1.42%, so slightly to 1.33%. And this would indicate falling competitiveness. However, the fact is that no country competes in all global markets, and the benchmark should be to examine how a country is faring in terms of its share of global trade in those sectors in which that country is specialising. Just for example, in 2012, the top 20 sectors in global merchandise exports included crude oil, natural gas, petroleum products, coal, cars, trucks, aircraft, car parts, aeroplane engines, iron ore, gold and jewels. Ireland is not a meaningful participant in any of these markets. However, if we look at Ireland's top 10 export sectors in 2004-2012, the top 10 export sectors in 2004 accounted for 61% of total of Irish exports. In the top 10 in 2012 accounted for 63%. That top 10 and the composition changed over the period because Ireland has been adjusting all the time. Its share of global exports in those sectors rose from 4.7% to 7.3%. And the value of exports in the top 10 sectors rose from $65 billion in dollar equivalent terms to $151 billion. So again, it depends on what benchmark you're using, essentially. And further pitfall relating to analysis of sectoral shares of global markets is how one defines the sectors you're actually dealing with. For example, in 2012, organic chemicals were Ireland's second most important merchandise export, just behind pharmaceutical products, with a total export value of $28 billion in dollar equivalent terms. Now, Ireland's share of global exports of organic chemicals fell from 7.9% in 2004 to 6.3% in 2012, indicating, using that measure, falling competitiveness. But the fact is that the great bulk of these exports come from a particular group of products called heterocyclic compounds used in manufacture of medicines. And they account for the great bulk of this organic chemical sector in the Irish case, but 2/3 of exports from this sector in 2004 and 3/4 in 2012. And Ireland's share of exports, global exports of heterocyclic compounds, actually rose between 2004 and 2012 from 21% to 23%. So if you look at if you use organic chemicals as your benchmark, you would say Ireland is losing competitiveness. If you use this subgroup of organic chemicals, you would see that Ireland's export share is rising. So that depends on how you define your sectors. Okay, so these are just a few basic caveats in terms of how we approach this particular issue before I go on to the real focus, I think, of my presentation. And what I'm saying here is that the performance of Irish exports and our export competitiveness in the years after 2000 have been the subject of an extraordinary process of what I would call distortion and misinterpretation on the part of a wide range of highly influential economic commentators. There has been almost virtually unanimous view, as I see it, from these commentators, leading to the creation of what I call a veritable myth surrounding Ireland's export competitiveness in the period in question. And this has actually achieved a status almost of accepted wisdom. And the key elements of this myth are that following the spectacular export growth of the 1990s, Ireland lost its export competitiveness in the decade after 2000, and that this loss of competitiveness was due largely, if not entirely, to Irish labour costs rising more quickly than in Ireland's main trading partners in this period. So basically, this I would say is an Irish economist's take on Ireland's recent export performance. Labour costs are the key to export competitiveness. Labour costs in Ireland rose more rapidly than Ireland's main trading partners during the 2000s, and as a result, Ireland experienced a major loss of export competitiveness in this period, reflecting a substantial loss in global market share. So just to take you through a few of these, Patrick Honohan, the Governor of the Central Bank, Anthony Lennon, the Professor of Economics at the University of Limerick, said since 2000, competitiveness has been lost rather severely to the plane of TCD. The loss of competitiveness in the private sector in recent years is referred to. John Fitzgerald of the SRI, there's been a very serious loss of competitiveness in recent years. Jim O'Leary, then in the Department of Economics, and Maynooth referred to a sharp decline in competitiveness of recent years. Gareth Fitzgerald referred to the disastrous decline in our national competitiveness. And then Morgan Kelly said after 2000, competitiveness collapsed. We priced ourselves out of world markets. There is one dissenting voice, by the way. Dan McLaughlin did say in 2007, the Republic has not lost competitiveness. Further, in explaining this, I'm going to give you another series of quotations. Alan Ahern of NUIG, and of course, economic advisor to Bertie Ahern. If we are to regain competitiveness, we have to do it a difficult way, through wage cuts. Morgan Kelly, the economy will not begin to grow until real wages fall to competitive international levels. Rossa White of David Research. Ireland has lost competitiveness in recent years. The relative performance is explained by divergent trends in nominal wage costs. Alan Barrow, again, the SRI. Wage falls are vital to the restoration of competitiveness. Jim O'Leary, again, we must enhance the competitiveness of the economy by facilitating the emergence of lower private sector wages. John Fitzgerald, again. Wage cuts of 5% in both the private and public sector are needed to achieve the necessary improvement in the economy's competitiveness. And Gareth Fitzgerald, again, he referred to the focus on pay necessary to restore competitiveness. That was the title of an article he had in the Irish Times. The last person there, I think, and Gareth Fitzgerald, was undoubtedly, I think, the most ardent proponent of the thesis that Ireland lost export competitiveness through excessive labour cost growth in the 2000s. He was, of course, former Taoiseach and UCD economist. And he advanced this argument repeatedly in the Saturday columns in the Irish Times in the years before his death. Fitzgerald particularly identified the sharp rise in labour costs associated with a surge of public spending by the Fianna Fáil government in the period up to 2003 as being responsible for what he termed a disastrous decline in Ireland's competitiveness over the 10 years previous. So the question is then, what is the evidence related to Ireland's export performance in the period between 2000 and 2007, and what happened with Irish labour cost trends in this period? So I'm going to first of all look at how overall export growth in Ireland grew and developed in this period compared with the other OECD countries based on OECD data. This is in volume growth of goods and services. Volume adjusts overall value growth for changes in prices. And this shows that Ireland's exports actually, growth in volume terms, rose rapidly in relation to the OECD between 2000 and 2002, and then after that, more or less rose in parallel with the rest of the OECD countries on average. So that by 2007, Ireland's exports in volume terms were 48% larger than they were in 2000, compared with an overall growth of 39% for the OECD. So clearly, therefore, Ireland's export performance was significantly better than that for the OECD as a whole over the period. And again, I think there's no evidence here of the sharp loss of competitiveness postulated by many economic commentators. And in fact, Ireland's export growth was superior to that of 19 of the 59 other members of the OECD, including the UK and the USA, who are our two major trade partners. Next, we broaden out the frame of reference to look at how Ireland's share of global exports trended in this period, and how this trend compared with Ireland's other main. I've identified our 12 main trade partners from the combined value of exports and imports, and I showed you in the tables here from the year 2007. So basically, the very bottom line here shows Ireland's share of total global exports in these 2 years, and Ireland's share actually rose in this period, very briefly, very slightly. And the indicator here to the right shows the second as a proportion of the first. So a figure of over 100 indicates rising share. And as you can see here, most economic countries who are our main trading partners actually declined, and Ireland's performance was overall better than our trading partners. And if you exclude China, which had particularly spectacular growth in this period, Ireland's, see a second last line, Ireland's performance was much better than, on average, our main trading partners, and particularly far better than the United States and the United Kingdom, both of which lost market share in this particular period. So, now this overall increase in Ireland's share of total global exports masks substantial differences between merchandise and service exports over the period. And I think a key problem, as I see it, for the interpretation of Ireland's competitiveness is the fact that it has tended to focus almost exclusively on merchandise exports. And it seems to me a lot of economists are finding it hard to get a grip with the fact that Irish service exports are now almost one half of total exports. And this is not helped by the fact, for example, that the CSO, if you go into their trade section, what they call foreign export trade is in actual fact merchandise export trade, and so on. And we repeatedly see the media with headlines about Ireland's exports declining and so on. They're referring to merchandise exports and ignoring service exports, which would be the main driver of Irish export growth, as shown by this. This shows Ireland's share of global exports total, which is the green line in the middle, export services, which is the top line, and merchandise, the bottom line. So overall, we can see that there was a short-term rise up to 2002, and then a more falling off up to 2007. For merchandise, you can see that there was an overall decline, but you can see services grew very, very strongly in this period. So interestingly, in year 2000, services and Irish merchandise accounted for a similar proportion of global trade in those two sectors. But by the end of the period, the global share of services was 3 times what it was in merchandise, because of the very divergent trends involved here. Now, just comparing, and I don't think I've got the table on this here. No, I haven't, though. Comparing Ireland's performance with that of its 12 main trading partners as regards merchandise trade, we find that 5 of our main trading partners increased their share of global merchandise trade, and 7 of our main trading partners lost global share in this period. And in fact, Ireland experienced a rate of loss in merchandise trade which was less than that for Japan, UK, and the USA. They all lost greater share of global exports of merchandise than Ireland did. As regards our share of global services exports, Ireland more than doubled its share over the period. And apart from China, none of the other main trading partners came anywhere near matching Ireland's performance. And 6 of our main trading partners actually lost market share and in fact the United States was the country which had the biggest loss of market share in global export of services in this period. Overall, therefore, while Ireland outperformed all of its main trading partners and the rest of the world as regards growth of services between 2002 and 2007, its performance as regards merchandise was a mixed bag. However, again, there is no evidence here of a general loss of competitiveness by the Irish economy. Overall, in fact, I would say the opposite occurred. Now, when accounting for Ireland's loss of share of global merchandise exports between 2000 and 2007, there are a number of special factors involved here. One of these was the rapid rise globally in the prices of minerals and fuels in this period, which boosted the global market share of countries with high relative endowments in these natural resources at the expense of countries like Ireland with lower natural resource endowments. Sorry, actually, just go back to this. This shows, actually, I think I've skipped one here, have I? Well, this gives you an idea of the market shares of our key service exports sectors. Computer services, operational leasing, which is mainly leasing of jet aircraft, insurance services, which is a spectacular growth of global share, merchanting and other trade-related services, which I think is mainly, as I can figure out, the sales offices in Ireland of multinational companies selling all over Europe, like Google, for example, financial services, and the bottom one here, miscellaneous business, professional, technical services, which doubled its global share. I think it's mainly the back office activities of foreign firms in Ireland, providing various services to European offices of multinational companies based here, with their headquarters here and so on. So where am I on this? Okay, I just want to show you here. I kind of explain why Ireland lost out in merchandise exports. One was this very rapid growth of the share of fuels and mining products in the global economy, which is a very tiny part of the Irish economy. So even if Ireland had experienced no change in the technical efficiency, it would have still have lost market share because of the very rapid growth of these sectors, which are not a part of the Irish economy. A second major factor to Ireland's loss of global share in merchandise exports was the double whammy experienced after 2000 by the office and telecommunications equipment sector, OTE, which accounted for 1/3 of Irish merchandise exports in 2000. The first part of the double whammy was the collapse in 2001 of the dot-com bubble, which had a major knock-on effect on the OTE sector because of the major drop-off in demand for computers, internet equipment and so on when that occurred. And global exports of OTE products fell by 13% in just 1 year globally between 2000 and 2001. However, this was a short-term shock. Of much greater long-term importance was the emergence in this period of China as a major global competitor in the sector. In 2000, China accounted for 4.5% of global trade in OTE and products, and 7 years later it was 23%, a 5-fold increase in share in a 7-year period. Now, the key factor here was China's very low cost base in what is a highly competitive industry, a factor which impacted seriously not just on Ireland but on most Western economies. Just show you here. OTE equipment shares of global exports. You can see China going from 4.5 to 2.9, a quintupling of its share. Ireland lost out at 40% of its share of the global market. Our 11 partners, trading partners, apart from China, also experienced about a 1/3 loss, just not as bad as Ireland. You can see that the Kingdom lost almost 2/3 of its global share in this sector in this period. The United States lost almost a half of its share, both worse than Ireland in terms of their rate of loss. Where are we going here now? So my argument then is that Ireland's loss of market share in this sector cannot be attributed to rising costs relative to Ireland's main trading partners, because they also lost out, some of them much more seriously than Ireland, and particularly our two major trading partners, the United Kingdom and the United States of America. So apart from this particular sector, there was very strong growth in most of the other major sectors, indicated here by the change in production values. This is from the International Trade Center data, which is a joint venture of the World Trade Organization, United Nations. And you can see here very, very rapid growth, particularly odoriferous mixtures, by the way, is despite the name, is actually drink extracts, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and all those. And again, you could talk about this interesting feature, but it's down as a chemical sector, but in actual fact is related to drink industries. But anyway, the point I'm making here is that there'll be very, very strong growth, even though the global shares have tended to decline in absolute terms. These major sectors all grew very strongly in this particular period. So our overall conclusions then are as follows. Ireland's exports grew more strongly than the OECD average in this period. Ireland increased its share of global exports, and like the majority of its main trading partners, there was particularly strong growth in export services. Most of the leading merchandise sectors also grew strongly. The inferior overall performance of the merchandise export sector is in large part, or to a considerable extent I would say, due to a major decline in the single sector, which accounted for a very large proportion of exports in 2000. Most of Ireland's trading partners also experienced a sharp decline in this sector, that Ireland's decline was not due to a loss of competitiveness vis-à-vis these trading partners. It was mainly in relation to China. And Ireland's competitive performance has in particular been superior to its two main trading partners, the United Kingdom and the United States. How many do for time there, Frank?
You've another 12 minutes.
Excellent, okay. So in the light of this evidence, as I see it, it's difficult to comprehend where the united chorus that Ireland lost competitiveness came from. It appears to me that so many Irish economists see labour costs as being crucial to competitiveness that they've assumed that if labour costs are rising, then competitiveness must be falling, without actually looking at the relevant data. Even then, there are major holes in the arguments advanced by economists, as I see it, about the link between labour costs and export competitiveness. And I'm going to explore this further by looking at Gareth Fitzgerald's Irish Times columns devoted to this topic. As I say, in these columns, Fitzgerald basically argued that unit labour costs in the Irish economy rose relative to the United States and Western Europe during this period, where the growth of industrial exports slowed down, and concluded that there must be a causal connection between the two. Now, the labour cost indicator which Fitzgerald used in his articles is the OECD's total economy unit labour cost, which is based on labour costs throughout the economy and not just in exporting firms. I'm pointing out here that exporting firms in Ireland account for about 12% of the total workforce. So, whereas this applies to all workers in all areas of work in Ireland. Much more relevant to the export sector is another OECD table not mentioned by Fitzgerald, which shows trends in unit labour cost of manufacturing, because in Ireland 80% of the output of manufacturing is exported. So clearly, in terms of export competitiveness, we should look more at this particular indicator rather than the general indicator of labour costs overall in the Irish economy. And the green line here is total economy ULCs, the indicator used by Fitzgerald. And again, I put in trend lines here to indicate clearly there was a substantial rise in the Irish case, which indicates rising costs. Whereas in the case of manufacturing unit labour costs, which are particularly important for exports, the overall trend has been slightly downwards. But clearly there's been a very substantial divergence between the two. Yet the first one was the one that Fitzgerald used to argue that labour costs were rising, whereas the second one, which I think is more relevant to the export sector, it shows that Irish unit labour costs were falling relative to the rest of the OECD. Of the 10 trading partners which data are available, in only 2, Japan and Sweden, the manufacturing unit labour costs fall faster than in Ireland. In 6 of the 10 major trading partners for Ireland, unit labour costs of manufacturing rose over the period, indicating a substantial improvement in our relative position relative to those. Now, comparative data on the unit labour costs in export services are not available. They're not published by the OECD. But if you look at the FORFAW surveys of the economic impact of state-aided economic activities in Ireland, and look at export services and unit labour costs, which are pay costs per worker divided by value added per worker, we find that unit labour costs in export services in Ireland fell by 27% between 2007 in the foreign-owned export services sector, which accounts for almost all of our export services. So again, in that sector, there was a significant decline in unit labour costs in this sector as well. Now, Fitzgerald's assertion to the effect that Irish manufacturing exports were negatively affected by the period after 2000 by rising labour costs is I think, based on a false premise, since relative labour costs in the manufacturing sector actually fell in this period. A further major flaw, I think, in Fitzgerald's argument was his failure to explain why, if rising labour costs in his view, were exerting a negative effect on the growth of industrial exports. Why were they not having a similar effect on services exports? Presumably, if labour costs apply to one, they should apply to the other. And of course, service exports were rising very rapidly in this period, despite his argument that labour costs were rising, which I don't think is true in any case. There's another major flaw in the argument of those who assert that labour costs are the key ingredient of export competitiveness. Again, you may recall a quotation I had here earlier on. Wage costs are an important component in the total costs of producing exports, from this Cassidy and O'Brien paper I mentioned earlier on. Well, in fact, they're not. I'm going to show a table here which shows for a number of our major export sectors, that most of them in manufacturing. You can see that export orientation. This is taken from the Census of Industrial Production. And they were as a percentage of total input costs as indicated by the CIP. And the last line we have the similar data for export services taken from the Forfar survey of economic impact. So all of these are highly geared toward exports. The labour costs, the maximum I think is 28%. The minimum, believe it or not, is office machinery and computers, which is just 4% according to the CIP data. The next point I would make here is that there's actually no relation between the percentage of costs taken up by labour costs and employment change. Now, you might expect, based on Fitzgerald's type of argument, that firms which had the highest percentage of costs taken up by labour costs might have the poorest employment growth or performance. But in actual fact, there's absolutely no link between the percentage of labour costs. In fact, a correlation between the two is almost zero, a Pearson correlation coefficient. And you can see, for example, that office machinery and computers, with just 4% of the total costs taken up by labour, declined by 36.4%. Whereas, for example, medical precision optic instruments, 25% of their total costs are made up by labour, but they expanded very, very rapidly in this period. So there's no link at all between them. The other thing to point out here, of course, is to show how variable the different sectors are in terms of their growth performance in this period, which shows you how futile it is to try to make overall general statements about what influences these sectors. They all have particular local factors and circumstances which influence their performance, and we can't make any real generalizations about them. Having said, apart from the fact that there's no link between the percentage of costs taken by labour and growth performance in employment, the other thing is, of course, that overall the share of total costs accounted for by labour are generally small. The overall average is 10.8%. For export services, it was 19.2% at that period, but in actual fact, by 2006, the export service, according to the Forfar the survey, labour accounted for only 10% of the costs, input costs of firms in the export services sector. So basically, the argument that labour costs are a major proportion of of costs in export industries clearly isn't true, despite what Jerry O'Brien and Cassidy said. Economic commentators appear to be unaware of the low share of labour costs in the total cost structure of Ireland's exporting firms. Another article, again with Jerry O'Brien, dealing specifically with the measurement of labour cost competitiveness, he stated, this is the largest costs incurred by firms are typically labour costs. But it's quite obvious from the previous table that they're not the case. It's not the case. Okay, so I regard therefore the view of competitiveness that's portrayed by a lot of leading Irish economists is simplistic and one-dimensional. And it contrasts sharply with the much more sophisticated approaches to measuring international competitiveness used by other groups. And the one I mentioned in particular, of course, is the Global Competitiveness Index, the GHCI, issued annually by the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I'll just take you through this.
5 minutes.
Okay. In this report, it employs no less than 113 different indicators in measuring the index for 144 different countries nowadays. And these comprise a mix of quantitative data based on official statistics and qualitative data based on a huge survey of business leaders and analysts from around the world. In 2008, 2009, they sent questionnaires to 12,294 people around the world, getting their view on various indicators of competitiveness, including 59 from Ireland. And then they divide these 113 indicators into 12 different pillars, as they call them, all of which are important across the board, but some of which are more important in different categories of economies. They divide the world's economies into three groups: factor-driven, efficiency-driven, and innovation-driven. And basically, the key ones for this one on the right is business sophistication and innovation. And this is the sector in which the WF places Ireland. In the system of weightage applied to the right-hand group of countries, labour costs factors account for just 1.7% of the total value of the competitive index. In other words, labour costs are considered to be almost irrelevant in terms of competitiveness to countries belonging in this group, and this is the one in which they place Ireland. And contrary again to the view of most Irish economic commentators, this index saw Ireland's competitiveness improving throughout most of the 2000s. In 2002, Ireland was in the 30th position. In 2007, Ireland had moved up to 22, so they thought that Ireland's competitiveness was improving this period, despite the commonly held view by Irish economists that it was going in the opposite direction. Now, there are a number of other international indicators, but I've listed here, but I haven't time to go through them, all of which, again, pay very little attention to labour costs as a factor in competitiveness, and all of which tend to place Ireland quite well up in most of the lists. Now, a final key factor I want to mention very briefly relating to Ireland's export competitiveness is the fact that, to a very large extent, the markets served by Ireland's exports aren't competitive at all. For a start, a large proportion of Irish merchandise exports consist of intermediate goods destined for further processing abroad, frequently by overseas affiliates of the Irish-based companies concerned, such as chemical compounds, we saw them earlier on, electronic components, and drink concentrates. Secondly, over half of Ireland's merchandise exports arise in the chemicals and pharmaceutical sector, which is dominated globally by a small number of major multinationals, most of which are based in Ireland, have a base in Ireland. And due to their size and control of patents, these firms do not operate in competitive markets and tend to be highly profitable. Profits as a percentage of revenues for pharmaceutical firms in the US Fortune 500, on average, are between 4 and 5 times greater than for other firms. They're much more profitable. This high profitability makes Ireland's low corporation tax rate, of course, very attractive while making the firms in question less concerned about costs than in more competitive sectors. Oligopoly is also a feature of other Irish export sectors. Microsoft is an obvious example. Its profits amounted to 30% of revenues in 2008 in the Global 500, over 6 times the average for all firms in the Fortune 500. Google, whose Irish operation has enjoyed spectacular growth, obviously, had a 28 profit rate, which was almost the same as Microsoft. Very, very profitable, operating in highly oligopolized sectors where their brand image in particular dominates the market. Apart from oligopolised markets, the very large proportion of foreign-owned operations in Ireland are largely involved in providing services to other units of the same firms. They're not selling in open markets, in other words. This implies the units engaged in R&D, software development for their parent firms, or providing centralised support services for affiliate units elsewhere in Europe and other regions, and also to IFSC operations, providing insurance and treasury management services to affiliate companies. It's impossible to quantify the importance of these, but they certainly consist of a very large proportion of our service exports. So the point I'm making here is that we've got a very large proportion of foreign firms in Ireland are exporting in markets that are not competitive, and therefore, to a certain extent, the whole argument about competitiveness becomes irrelevant in their case. How am I going to there? Just when you finish up?
1 minute.
Okay, just when
you can take 2.
I just want to show how the view of spokespersons, the leading key figures in major multinationals in Ireland, emphasise a totally different set of factors in relation to competitiveness than do the series of economists that I quoted earlier on. So this is the Vice President of ABB, and they can go through it. It is not low cost to attract companies to invest in certain countries. It is high productivity, quality and innovation that are crucial to their decision. And Ireland clearly stands out. Paul Rellis, the GM of Microsoft Ireland at the time, we need to add value faster than we add costs. Faster productivity growth provides a clear route for higher living standards in the future. The time is now appropriate to design and implement clear and coordinated policies that will quicken productivity growth in the years ahead. Martin Murphy, then the MD of Hewlett-Packard at 2009. Competitiveness will not be achieved by cutting costs alone. We have to deliver a better service at a lower cost through innovation. Craig Barrett, the former chairman of Intel. The only ways to compete are in the new industries, the value-added jobs where intelligence and training and skills are important, or jobs are very capital intensive, like computer chip manufacturer, because labour cost is not so much of an issue. And finally, Jim O'Hara, then the General Manager of Intel Ireland, unless there is a foundation of a highly educated workforce and the internationally recognised commitment to a reputation for research and innovation, Ireland will not be considered competitive. So just to finish off then, Paul, if I may, it would seem to me that these arguments by key industrial leaders at the coalface of the old marketplace have had a minimal impact, it seems to me, on the economics profession, or those at least who gets quoted in the newspapers and in the media. And of course, many of these people are also government advisors and shapers of public opinion. In fact, there's been a bit of an improvement in Ireland's export performance in the last few years, and there's also been a fall in general labour wages in the economy. And again, they're making a connection, saying that it was the fall in labour costs which led to this improvement in. You see this written down constantly. We've improved our competitiveness because labour costs have fallen, and so on. However, it is very unlikely that wage costs are of any great importance for the services firms in driving the recent recovery of exports. Just two figures on this. According to the documents filed with the Companies Office, the average remuneration of a Microsoft Ireland employee in 2010 was €104,000, up from €87,000 2 years previously. This includes stock options, but not pension or social welfare contributions. At the rapidly growing Google operation, the average salary in 2010 was €79,000. These are highly profitable companies for whom wage costs, I would say, are of little importance. And of course, the high profitability itself is dependent on their being located in Ireland, where transfer pricing and other forms of creative accounting allow them to avoid paying taxes on a vast scale. So on the one side, we have the industrial leaders, the World Economic Forum, and international economics gurus like Michael Porter and Paul Krugman, arguing that for a country like Ireland, competitiveness is all about enhancing productivity through investment in education, training, science, technology and innovation. On the other hand, we have large numbers of Irish economists with what I consider to be an absurd fixation with labour costs, to the virtual exclusion, in my experience, to any other consideration in this area. And in the middle we have the government, which, if I may say so personally, I'm speaking personally here, is bereft of ideas, vision, and I would also say rational decision-making capacity. We have a government fixated on itself and reducing spending. We have a political system which is incapable of making hard selected decisions in the long-term interests of the broader economy. So it is decreed that all areas of government spending must be cut back at a time when we should be expanding our investment in education, and particularly, I would argue, at third level. So I hope, just the last sentence, Paul, I hope I have shown in this paper that the fixation of Irish economists, or at least some Irish economists, on labour cost reductions is not only wrong-headed, but profoundly inimical to Ireland's long-term economic interests. We need to focus attention on the issue of productivity growth and how this can be achieved. But this will require a cultural conversion among economists, which I think is hard to envisage. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks very much, Proinnsias.
Or we've got to get government to ignore them.
Sorry?
Or we've got to get government to ignore them.
Anyway,